One of the greatest tragedies in life is our inability to enjoy things. And as students, sometimes when we get too far into the wall, or when we get too far, too narrow focus in our pursuits, this becomes a really big problem. Or if we are sort of like the party type, this inability to deal with boredom, it really runs on both sides. I don't care if you're the extroverted type or introverted type. We really, as a society as a whole, we have this inability to deal with boredom. And I think today's video is going to be a video essay on boredom. How do we handle it? Why is it such a problem? And how do we find the root problem of this very, very complicated problem of people's inability to deal with boredom? So I think this is going to be a really information-packed episode. So sit back, relax, get some popcorns, and then just listen to this entire exploration on the nature of language and everything in between. So we're going to talk about, first of all, bring in one of my favorite philosophers of all time. So also view this episode kind of as like an introduction to Ludwig, some of the works of Ludwig Wittgenstein. So we're going to use Wittgenstein as a framework here to tackle boredom. And I think that's a really, really good way to relate philosophy back to reality, philosophy back to life, which is what philosophy is really supposed to do if you're doing it correctly. So in a sense, Wittgenstein famously said that the limit of my language is the limit of my world. So if our language is limited, I really want to draw your attention to this idea of the way that you use language relates to so much of what you do in life that you virtually cannot escape this problem of language in your life. And because language is so ubiquitous, and if you've never bothered to learn a foreign language, you can't exactly see the importance of language, the role that a language plays in your life. So speaking of which, this episode was brought to you by Babbel. And before we dive into the very deep dive into how do we deal with boredom, just a quick note on Babbel. Babbel is a great way for you to learn a new language and to expand the limits of your world. And Babbel is such a great app that you can realistically devote 10 to 15 minutes per day to practicing a new language in a very down-to-earth kind of way, in a very practical way. And Babbel offers some of the most practical lessons, and I'm currently taking some lessons on French slangs. Because as a part of my formal degree in French, I have to read a lot of novels in French. I have to read a lot of academic journals in French. I don't exactly get that practical aspects of those very practical slang terms or terms that I should use to actually speak to French people. I don't really get a lot of opportunities to practice those more informal aspects of French. So Babbel for me currently is the perfect medium for me to explore the more informal parts of French. And si tu veux prendre le français, si tu veux lire par exemple un roman en français, si tu veux par exemple commander un café en français, be sure to give Babbel a try. And it is simply one of the greatest learning experiences ever. It doesn't take that much work from you. And if you're ready, Babbel is offering lucky viewers of this channel a 65% off on your premium subscription. So click the link in the description down below, and it comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. So check them out. It's a great app, and use this app to expand the limits of your world. So let's come right back to Wittgenstein. So just a brief summary of Wittgenstein's work before we could tackle boredom. So Wittgenstein, in a sense, his earlier work dealt with the logic of language. He studied under the famous mathematician Bertrand Russell, and his entire project in his first book, his only published work in his lifetime, was to formalize language into something that is clear and understandable. To formalize language, in a sense, reduce it down to a logical system where he famously said in the conclusion of this very baffling short little book on the logic of language, is that where one cannot speak, there one must be silent. So in a sense, he followed Russell's footsteps and tried to reduce language to a very precise system of logic and system of how do we conduct ourselves using language in the most precise way possible. How do we speak more carefully just so we know what we mean exactly to another person? How can we communicate in a way that is super precise? Because in philosophy, the mode of language, or you're using language to communicate your insights. And if we can't even get these bits of language right, how do we communicate anything at all? So that was Wittgenstein's concern. And he, in a sense, devoted his first book to solving the logic of the language. But then he went off on his own. he had a row with Bertrand Russell. The two of them kind of fell out. And then after he came back from his little break from philosophy back to Cambridge, he started writing something in his famous 2 volumes, the Blue Book and the Brown Book, which is collected in this collection called Major Works of Ludwig Wittgenstein, which I highly recommend. This is a really great introduction to some of these works. So basically, in the Blue Book and the Brown Book, Wittgenstein reconsidered a lot of the things that he believed about language. So instead of finding something that is perfectly clear, a logical form of language, he opened himself up to this idea that language functions as language games. So for example, someone needs assurance. They don't need you to provide facts on a certain thing. Hence, they're playing the game of, should I say, the assurance game. For example, I'm telling you this math problem is driving me up the wall. That driving me up the wall is not a descriptive game, because it's literally, I'm not going up the wall, but it's an idiomatic sort of language game. So Wittgenstein, in his later projects, in a sense, opened himself up to all of these language games and opened himself up to all these variations of how language should be conducted. And he basically said in one of the paragraphs that language cannot be reduced down to one formal system. It cannot be reduced down to what he was trying to do earlier. Every form of expression, every word even, they tend to have different functions under different contexts. And even the expressions that you use, he in a sense said that there's a semantic aspect of communication, but there's also the practical aspect of communication. So the images that you trigger within another person, when you say something, for example, that is an expression, or that is an impression that you're impressing upon the other person that is beyond your control. So you cannot formalize this process, and you cannot dictate. You can try as hard as you can, but you cannot dictate what kind of images you're evoking in another person. And he basically drew this beautiful analogy, is that trying to be super precise with your language, trying to reduce language down to kind of like a formal system, it is as if you're prescribing rules to a children's ball game. You know, kids, they're just running around doing their things. They're making up rules as they go. And language sort of functions in the same way, according to Wittgenstein. So he basically said that you cannot dictate what impression that you want to cast upon the receiver. You can have the best intentions as the speaker, but the words that you use and the impression that you're going to cast upon the other person, it's going to be different. The sort of impression that you want to communicate is going to be different. So in a sense, your private truth, once you've communicated that to another person, it is going to be received in a very different light. So that's the premise of sort of this language game that Wittgenstein is proposing. It's a very simplified view. So because I'm running short on time here, I would really recommend you to read the Blue Book and the Brown Book to sort of derive these conclusions yourself. And one of the most interesting things from these 2 volumes is the idea of sort of like the shadow of this meaning, or a shadow of an impression. So semantically, for example, I say, here's an apple. But then in your head, for example, I'm referring to something that doesn't really exist. For example, I ate an apple this morning. And that expression, it has a semantic sort of logical semantic meaning. But in your head, that's going to conjure up this picture, very immediate picture in your head of an apple that I ate this morning. So Wittgenstein basically said that impression, it is sort of like, it cannot be analyzed. That impression is so spontaneously generated that we cannot cast some kind of logical form to that apple. So what color's the apple? That has to be interpreted by the receiver. And then how do I know it is precisely that kind of apple? So this automatic image that we've conjured up from listening in to other people's descriptions, that's a very different image from the intentional image that the speaker's trying to project onto you, right? So even though the speaker can have the best intentions, the image that you're going to receive in your head will be a very different picture. So how does all this language theory relate to boredom? How does all of this tie back together into a very beautiful sort of conclusion? So think about how you're interacting with social media. Think about how you're filtering your experience through social media. Think about the way that you view tweets or Facebook updates or texts from your friends. Now, human beings, when they communicate, the image that we receive, this act of language, the impression that these posts are going to have on you is very different to the actual life of these, these speakers, right? So in the case of a language theory, we know that the impression, the immediate shadow of an impression that we receive in our heads, it's going to be very different to the intended meaning of the speaker. Then that also means that these information that we're receiving from Instagram, from Twitter, these linguistical things, or these descriptions of people's lives, these stories that people tell you about their lives, they are in a sense going to cast a very different impression in your head. And in most cases, more often than not, these impressions will be exaggerated, they will be dramatized, because that's the function of storytelling, is to dramatize reality, and to sort of create this cohesive narrative of another person's life. All right. So Andy Warhol, in his documentary, The Andy Warhol Diaries on Netflix, he famously said that this is a paraphrase, by the way, people think that when things happen in movies, when things happen in movies, it always carries this emotional charge. Whereas when the same things, when they happen in your life, you feel nothing because you're simply experiencing it yourself. And that's the danger of storytelling, and that's the danger of us constructing a narrative about other people's lives without taking a look at directly at our own lives, and to realize and to we become very dissatisfied with ourselves, because here you are. Sorry, that's the microphone. Here you are taking the best bits of other people's lives, taking the best bits of their storytelling, and you're casting this impression in your head that everyone else, they're all living perfect lives, they're all living fantastic lives, and they all have a very cohesive narrative about their lives in your head, that you feel like you're the only one out of that entire group who's not having any fun, who's in a sense dissatisfied, who's in a sense left behind, who's in a sense the boringest, the most boring one out of the entire group. So you have that false impression about yourself, and that drives you to sort of escape this impression by seeking more excitement, by seeking more things in your life, by seeking more achievements, more parties, more academic achievements. And this is a never-ending cycle, simply because you've been feeding yourself this false impression of other people's lives. And this is really, really playing with your head, really fucking with your perception of the world. Hence, language is one of these things that is so tricky that if you don't have a proper understanding of how this process, or why this process is literally driving you nuts, you will probably never break out of this one. If you let the shadow of other people's thinking cast these erroneous impressions upon your mind that you're being left behind, that you're the only one who doesn't have like a good cohesive narrative of your own life, then you're going to be constantly seeking something more. You're going to be constantly dissatisfied with your ordinary reality, your ordinary day-to-day interactions. You think there's always something better out there. And this inability to recognize that probably there isn't anything more. Probably there isn't anything outside of your direct reality. Probably that boring train ride to school first thing in the morning, that's probably all there is to it. Every morning you're heading to the library, for example, for me, now as a third-year university student, that 4-hour study session first thing in the morning, that's probably all there is, And this narrative that you're constructing about other people, if you constructed the same narrative out of your own life, other people, when they look at that narrative, they're probably going to think that you're living the best life possible. You're living the best life possible. So it's very easy for us to slip into the trap of always thinking that we're living in the reality that's a little more bland. Hence, this reduces our capacity to appreciate the mundane that we have that other people do not have access to. And this brings about a very deep form of dissatisfaction. And I'm basically arguing that you need to completely rewire that process of thinking that other people are living better lives. You need to completely deconstruct a narrative that you've constructed out of other people. And you need to start paying attention to your own direct experience and some of your own little narratives that you're creating for yourself, and to somehow reframe all the boring stuff that you're doing into a kind of narrative about your own life, into a kind of cohesive narrative, and to sort of disengage from other people's stories. Literally, on Instagram, it's a very literal thing. To disengage with other people's stories and to start forming your own personal, private story that's actually going to make you fulfilled. To start to appreciate the mundane a little more. So start to appreciate that boring train ride to university. Start to appreciate those quiet hours of just reading a book. Start to appreciate being bored when you have nothing to do, when you're waiting for someone at a bus stop or something. Start to appreciate those gaps in your narrative, because life is not always going to be exciting. There are going to be peaks of like going to a party or crowning achievement or like academic success or graduation, but life is mainly composed out of these gaps. And if you don't have a healthy way of dealing with these gaps, if you're always filling these gaps up with something that you wish that you could be doing or something that's a little more exciting, you're always going to be stuck. You're always going to be stuck there forever. And I think this is something that we need to reconcile with and start practicing when we're young, especially when we're young. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to get to the age of 40, for example, or the age of 50 and retire having not developed this ability to enjoy the gaps between events and to somehow always live in a land of stories, or this delusion that one day life is going to be picturesque all around, or life is going to be a series of perfect moments. But I rather live in a reality where even the gaps are satisfying. Even the periods where there's not a lot of things going on, even that period is satisfying. So that's, in a sense, the conclusion that I really want to reach in this video. So, in conclusion, language plays a very tricky thing on your brain, where all of these people sharing their lives, they're casting the wrong narrative into your head. They're casting the wrong impression into your head. So you literally think that everyone is having fun. Everyone's having some sorts of experiences that you're not having. But what you're neglecting here is the function, the sinister function of narrative and the sinister function of storytelling. That if you can somehow turn that switch off, you can somehow reframe this in your head, that is the path towards a more healthy attitude towards life, in a sense. And thank you for watching this video. It's a slightly longer one. Thank you for pulling through. And RC Waldun here. Thank you for watching this episode on Wittgenstein, a brief introduction to Wittgenstein's work and how to deal with boredom. And I will see you in the next video essay. Goodbye.